From Gaza to Ukraine, today's war zones are being used as testing grounds for a new type of technology driven by artificial intelligence.
The fear of creating an indomitable monster is growing around the world as AI development...
The unprecedented killing of Gazans is being powered, at least in part, by AI.
With superpowers battling for AI supremacy, many experts fear we're hurtling towards an unstoppable arms race.
The spectre of killer robots is real and terrifying to many people. And yet AI is already changing war's rules of engagement. Billions of dollars are now being pumped into AI weapons technology, much of it from Silicon Valley venture capitalists. Where is this technology headed, and what does it mean for civilians on the ground or those caught up in the crossfire? These are questions that preoccupy Elke Schwartz. She's a professor of political theory at Queen Mary University of London in the UK, and she researches the relationship between technology and violence and where humans fit into the mix. She's been digging into the companies driving the race for AI-enabled warfare, the promises being sold, and the dangers it might unleash. I'm Gemma Ware, and this is The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. Hi there, Elke. Welcome.
Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Could you set the scene for us? What do we know right now about the way AI is currently being used by militaries around the world?
There isn't, unfortunately, the practice of annual reports about how AI is exactly used by every military around the world. So a lot of the uses of AI by various military organizations rest on speculation. That is to say, we simply don't have a set of data where we know, okay, AI has been used in this and this context, by this and this military, with this and this effect. Having said that, artificial intelligence is simply a very, very sophisticated statistical processing tool, a data analysis tool as such. And so many military organizations do use it in various ways.
AI is being used by militaries to optimize and streamline various operations, such as logistics, translation, and supply chain management. It can help identify potential issues before they occur and coordinate military assets.
So any task in which AI is used to optimize, streamline, make a process more efficient, for that, AI is very good and is already used in the military context.
Where things get thorny, though, is when AI is used to take on the decision-making process that is usually done by humans.
Here we're talking about systems that take on some sort of decision support role for commanders, that take on an increasing role in command and control functions. So these are the systems that we are very concerned about as a civil society member. And those are the systems that we've heard about in the context of reporting on the war on Gaza.
According to Israeli investigative journalists at 972 Plus magazine, Israel has been using an artificial intelligence machine called Lavender to identify thousands of potential Hamas targets at Gaza.
In the Plus 972 article, systems like Gospel or Lavender or Where's Daddy take a more active role in the targeting loop.
According to the Plus 972 investigation published in April 2024, a system called Lavender reportedly marked over 37,000 Palestinians as suspected Hamas militants for possible targeting through airstrikes. In the early stages of the war, the investigation suggests the Israeli army gave sweeping approval for officers to adopt Lavender's kill lists, with little attempt to examine whether the targets had been correctly identified. Israel has allegedly developed and used other AI-enabled systems during its ongoing war in Gaza, called Where's Daddy and the Gospel. In response to the investigation, the Israeli Defense Force denied that it used AI systems to predict whether somebody was a terrorist, and said that the IDF is bound by and acts according to international law, directing its attacks only at military targets and military operatives. Other initiatives, like the US military's Project Maven, launched in 2017, provide a glimpse into how AI is reshaping military operations. The technology focuses on speeding up the analysis of video footage captured by drones.
With Project Maven and with programs like Lavender and Gospel also, what you basically have as a kind of like a sensor and sometimes weapons platform, such as a drone, for example, which is connected to an AI component. And the AI component or system is calibrated towards a certain goal, say, to identify what constitutes a possible target, human or otherwise, based on a number of input parameters.
That could be something as clearly marked as a military tank or a military building, but it could also be a target defined more broadly, such as any male of a specific age, carrying a stick-like object.
This AI system then evaluates the sensor data that is collected by the platform through other sources and then gives a percentage, say 80% confidence that a suggested target is an appropriate target. So then the system makes either a recommendation to an operator to take action, and the operator then takes an action. Or if the system were to be fully autonomous and it is connected with a lethal weapons platform, then it can take that action itself. And all of that happens within seconds. And the goal is to really shorten that, what is called the sensor to shooter timeline, from minutes to seconds. So it's about acceleration and using AI really to accelerate that entire process. And very often, this is not just one AI system. They are layered, right? There's different types of AI systems. So in the context of Gaza, the report suggests that Gospel has been used with a number of other AI type of systems to work in tandem and accelerate the action chain, if you will, in that way.
So we're not really clear yet whether the full automation level that you suggest is possible has happened, or where it's happened, to what extent. And also, we're not yet talking about fully fledged swarms of AI-enabled drones, though, although perhaps that's something that a lot of militaries are aiming for. We don't really know that's happening yet anywhere. Is that right?
We don't have clear-cut empirical evidence. The closest documented case was in 2020 in Libya. A UN report indicated that a drone system, a Turkish drone system, the Karhu 2, was used in what could be considered fully autonomous mode, meaning it didn't report back, or it was cut off from its human operator after activating in order to pursue targets. But even the producer of the drone has kind of rolled back in their marketing material as to whether the system will be used, can be used, should be used autonomously. So there's a fair bit of animosity, and rightfully so, in publicizing the fully autonomous capabilities of systems. And it is very difficult to identify whether such systems have been used in fully autonomous mode, as they can potentially, or whether, as it is still the international consensus, that there's always a human operator in the loop somewhere to mitigate the decision or make some sort of like meaningful decision in that action chain.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Even if the system's got the ability for a human operator to flip a switch and say, yes, we're going into autonomous mode, would that ever be turned on, and how?
It may very well be turned on, and there might be a tremendous allure. And there have been stories, rumors about a more fully autonomous kind of functioning in the context of Russia and Ukraine. And of course, in a hot conflict, I think the animosities to use that fully autonomous mode are shrinking, right? But the suggestion is that we're moving towards full autonomy in certain circumstances.
The insertion of AI into the defense industry is attracting serious amounts of money. In 2024, the global military AI market was worth an estimated $13.3 billion, with a projected growth to $35 billion in the next 7 years.
There's an enormous potential for growth, and with that, of course, financial growth, driven also by increasing security concerns and the emerging possibility to disrupt the defense sector as well. So the US is setting the pace here in the foregrounding AI in the military, but also as a market. There was a 2021 National Security Commission on AI report. The commission was chaired by Eric Schmidt. Eric Schmidt is a former head of Google. And the report recommends that the Defense Department should waste absolutely no time to integrate AI into absolutely every critical function, into existing systems, into legacy systems, or swap legacy systems for new systems, into exercises, into wargaming, and the quote is to become an AI-ready force by 2025, which would be next year. Fair amount of urgency to really bring AI into the military fold in absolutely all aspects.
The growing appetite for AI in defense is reflected in America's increasing military spending on these technologies and the way it's cozying up to startups developing AI-driven military tech.
There was a Brookings report which indicated that in the year from 2022 to 2023, federal contract allocations for military artificial intelligence nearly tripled, with a potential increase in the value of the contracts of 1,200%.
Wow.
These are staggering, really staggering numbers. And in many ways, they dwarf any other changes in allocations for funding.
While the US government isn't directly funding VC firms, it's awarding lucrative contracts and seed funding to military tech startups, which in turn boosts their valuation and benefits venture capital investors.
I thought it was really noteworthy that the Deputy Defense Secretary, Kathleen Hicks, was a keynote speaker at a venture capital firm's event last year. That was Andreessen Horowitz, which is one of the most prolific venture capitalist firms. And they have an initiative called American Dynamism, which focuses on national security, those kinds of products and goods.
I think there's more ability to see how you as an individual innovator or investor can contribute to the, to the American experience, to American dynamism, dare I say.
The venture capital investment in military products, that kind of segment is booming. It has surged in the US alone in the years from 2019 to 2022 from 16 billion to 33 billion. And looking at that kind of trajectory, it's becoming clear that since, let's say, 2014, this venture capital type of investment in defense has really accelerated through various ways. So it's a relatively small and almost want to say tight-knit community that pursue similar interests, and that is getting investment for startups to then cash out on those investments ultimately. That's the logic of venture capital portfolios.
And there are some startups that have made it a bit big, aren't they? Palantir would be one of them. But who are the other names that have become slightly more emblematic of the success of this so far?
Yes. So there are a number of companies that make the news frequently. So that's Shield AI, that is Palantir, although Palantir is no longer technically a startup, and that is Anduril. Palantir is the most mature of these companies, and Anduril is, let's say, the poster child of the sector with a extremely high valuation of 14 billion.
Defense startup Anduril recently raising $1.5 billion, bringing the company's valuation to $14 billion.
And Anduril itself is in many ways an offshoot of Palantir. And it's in essence has been founded by former Palantir staff. You know, many people that have found their footing in Palantir and make a lot of money in Palantir, then went to lend their weight and experience to Anduril. And Anduril is supported by both Andreessen Horowitz and Founders Fund. So Founders Fund is backed by Peter Thiel's venture capitalist fund. Peter Thiel got really wealthy through PayPal, but then he founded Palantir. Now he's backing Anduril. So you see there's kind of like an entanglement of actors. Similarly with Andreessen Horowitz, a venture capitalist firm that kind of supports those increasingly prominent companies. And the reason why they have a high investment potential is because they have high valuations, over 1 billion, which makes them unicorns.
Investors are drawn to these so-called unicorn companies, valued at over $1 billion because they promise huge potential for further growth and cash outs.
Venture capitalists traditionally was not so interested in breaking defense or disrupting defense because it was considered a consolidated and mature market where the processes are just far too slow.
There have also been some very big players dominating all the contracts.
Traditionally, there has been a tight entanglement between the government and the so-called primes. And the primes are the top 5, the traditional military defense contractors, literally a handful of heavyweights in that sector who have held the largest market share and still hold the largest market share in the defense sector for quite a while. So contracts would run over many years until fulfillment or fruition. And that worked for the big defense primes. They held a fair grip on the market for quite a long time. There was also a sense that it is ethically frowned upon to profiteer from defense and from military endeavor or from conflict in that way.
But then around 2014, something shifted. 2 startups, SpaceX and Palantir, sued the US military over what they said were unlawful procurement strategies that excluded other companies from the opportunity to bid for defense contracts. SpaceX dropped its case when the US Air Force changed its bidding rules. And then in 2016, a judge ruled in favor of Palantir's case against the US Army, and the company subsequently secured a contract worth $823 million. Since then, both companies have begun disrupting the defense market, winning multiple US government contracts.
It was quite interesting to see that these moral qualms were shifted aside very quickly once it looked possible to disrupt that defense sector and to start aligning the requirements of VC returns with the defense structures themselves, or vice versa.
Now the throttle is fully pushed down, and in December, the Financial Times reported that Palantir and Anduril were in talks with around a dozen other tech companies, including OpenAI and SpaceX, to create a consortium that would directly bid for US government work. This VC funding model, it's built around a business model where investments are high risk and they may potentially come with big returns at the same time. So high risk, big returns. How is this logic of the VC world and the way it's funded affecting the world of military AI and the startup?
Venture capital firms are entities that really basically just raise money from a number of partners. They're called limited partners. They can be pension funds, endowments, insurance companies, corporations, high net worth individuals to invest in promising startups that otherwise might be too risky for, let's say, a big bank loan or other types of investors. And the people give money in exchange for equity. And this equity then cashes out once the startup company becomes publicly traded, or it gets bought out by a bigger fish in the sector. So these are the two ways of exiting, that's called. And these are the two ways by which investors make their money back, and ideally outsized gains. So they need a company to grow in valuation relatively quickly, comparatively speaking, in the defense context. And to grow in valuation, you need contracts, not necessarily fully finished products as such, but you need to show and demonstrate this potential for growth, which leads to higher valuations, which then leads to greater possible capital gains.
Statistically, a huge proportion, more than 2/3 of all startups fail, leaving only a fraction that achieve success in the longer run.
There's a small percentage that will make it absolutely big. And that doesn't come naturally, or that just comes accidental. That's usually pushed and promoted, and the VC managers, the general partners themselves, are usually quite interested in making that happen. So a successful startup has to grow fast and has to demonstrate huge ambitions. And in order to receive continual funding, and these startups burn sometimes through money, in order to receive continual funding, like seed funding first, then Series A, Series B, Series C, and so on. These cycles run between 12 and 18 months. So you have to make big promises. You have to think big. You need to declare big intentions, possibly unobtainable, but really alluring kind of goals. I'm not saying it's all fantasy, but it's certainly there's an exaggeration to all of that. You need to sell your products and your ideas in order to secure funding beyond this initial series stage funding. And you need to make yourself look indispensable. Create a vision of inevitability.
This vision of inevitability often relies on lofty terms borrowed from the playbook of Silicon Valley.
So revolutionary, groundbreaking, everything will revolutionize absolutely everything. Yeah, there's a method to all of that.
Despite all the money and the at times aggressive tactics that military tech startups use, persuading a military to buy and use their products is still a difficult business. The returns on all that investment then are by no means guaranteed.
There is the possibility that products get developed that will require frequent updates and that will turn out to be not so useful in warfare.
There's an allure, though, to testing products out in real war zones.
We hear that in the Ukraine-Russia conflict is a testing ground for many of these technologies, that Gaza is a testing ground for many of these technologies that then help gather data, which feeds back into these kinds of systems.
But real-world testing isn't just about improving the technology, it's also part of the strategy to create narratives that attract investors. Military startups rely on these warfare testing grounds to then be able to make big claims about the capabilities of their tech. Elke gave me an example of how this can play out in practice. Take Palmer Luckey. He's the CEO of Anduril Industries.
Anduril is such an interesting example because the CEO, the Palmer Luckey, is a very colorful figure. He wears Hawaiian shirts and flip-flops. He used to develop a headset, so he used to be CEO of Oculus Rift.
I'm a propagandist. I'll twist the truth. I'll put forward only my version of it if I think that that's going to propagandize people to be what I need them to believe.
And he says, look, in 50 years, from now, everything will be transparent. The seas will be transparent. The skies will be transparent. We're going to know where every submarine is. And he says, with AI, we have the ability to win absolutely every war. That is purely fiction. He cannot make those claims because we don't have the data about these claims. Warfare has a long history of being very brutal and terrible, unexpected, and not predictable in any kind of way, and full of subterfuge and subversion and surprise and all of these kinds of things. So by focusing the attention toward a fantasy of omniscience, of winning wars through technology, is a dangerous kind of myth to create, but one that is very lucrative for those that seek to make their technologies indispensable in order to gain higher valuations. The most vocal ones of these startups and their VC supporters certainly suggest that warfare can only be won with more AI. It can be won swiftly, with more precision. And, this word humanely is always bandied about as well. And that is the way in which that is marketed to policymakers as well as militaries.
Elke believes that this narrative raises big ethical questions about how military decision-making is evolving under the influence of Silicon Valley.
Ethical deliberation requires that we sit with sometimes, most profound discomfort about possible decisions and having to take responsibility for that decision. Very much in contrast to many technology industry products which prioritize convenience and the mitigation of discomfort as such. Now, if the military adopts the ethos of Silicon Valley, if it is reshaped in the image of Silicon Valley, then ethical considerations themselves will be shifted to the margins in favor of what is perceived as technological progress as such. And then technological innovation becomes the, let's say, master value above all other values.
Elke says there are signs there's been a radical shift away from the traditional ethical qualms that venture capital investors used to have. She gives the example of Mark Andreessen, one of the partners at Andreessen Horowitz, a venture capital firm that recently backed a military drone boat startup valued at $1 billion. In 2023, Mark Andreessen wrote the Techno-Optimist Manifesto, a self-published essay in which he argued that many significant problems of humanity have been solved with the development of technology.
He makes no secret of the fact that, and here I paraphrase him, that ethics, regulation, governance, any kind of oversight is, and he calls it the enemy of human flourishing with technology. It's not really giving me a whole lot of hope there, if you will. If we lose sight of the role of ethics in and for warfare, we're really in trouble. War is a really dreadful human affair. Ethics plays a role in thinking about warfare.
When the promise of massive financial returns is at stake, ethics often takes a backseat.
You sell more products, you get more contracts when you raise the prospect of a crisis. Raising a prospect of tensions, global tensions, is extremely helpful. So that means conjuring up an always latent possibility of warfare. It's an old truism that war is good business for those who can profit from it. The invocation of crisis really is this crucial shaping of a narrative of inevitability that these products that the startups are making and selling are inevitable towards peace. It's a strange utilization of crisis for selling a product, and that, of course, amplifies tensions globally. You can't just conjure something up without it having some consequences. And I think it adds to global instabilities as such. So this perpetual bellicose kind of way of thinking produces a perpetual bellicose kind of context. And I think that is dangerous. Very often China is then raised. And this is not to say that China doesn't have any malintent or kind of problematic ambitions of its own, but these tensions are then ostensibly addressed with technologies of warfare rather than through diplomatic means.
Ultimately, it's those directly caught in the brutal context of war who bear the heaviest burden of the pursuit of profits using as yet unproven technologies.
It normalizes churning out potentially unproven, potentially flawed, untested technologies in the context of warfare onto the battlefield. You can expect more harm to come from it for either the targeted population or even the people in the field themselves. On top of all of that, we know that from the software products that we use ourselves, you need frequent updates for them to even function smoothly. In order to make sure that works the way it is intended, you have to do regular and repeated testing, evaluations, verification and validation processes. And to what degree that is even possible is much debated still. And so whenever you have insufficient technology or technology that is not sufficiently tested, the challenge and the risk is that greater harm comes to those that are in the crosshairs of these technologies.
You've written that speed and lethality are the watchwords for military tech. What do you think this logic of speed is doing to the way militaries are expected to operate now?
I've written about this for a long time, and I am very concerned that wherever you have a certain technology that becomes really pervasive, so does the logic of its inner workings. And AI type of technologies are really good at speed and scale. There's no way we can process as much information, so we have to trust an AI system and its decision in this context of speed and scale.
That means trusting the decision of a system that relies on data that may be biased.
What kind of context was this data gathered in? Is this data sufficient? Is it synthetic data? So there's not necessarily always a full scale of being able to know all the relevant parameters in order to make meaningful human decisions.
And AI systems make decisions at a pace that is beyond what a human can process.
So that means human agents are cognitively unable to override computational decisions, can't have enough knowledge about an AI-determined situation. No matter how transparent the AI is, it's just a different modality and not enough time to intervene in an accelerated action chain. And the consequences of that is what has been reported in the Plus 972 article on Gospel, Lavender, and Where's Daddy?
Remember, these are the AI-enabled systems that Israel has allegedly developed to identify targets in Gaza.
So it becomes not about taking out an imminent threat necessarily, but it becomes about creating as much output as possible. Like a production line logic enters the field. So more is more, action more, faster.
More targets.
More targets. The ethos of why we target, why we kill in war, and to what end becomes entirely removed in favor of a process, an accelerated process of more targets that are actioned in a speedier way. It's like a optimizing workflow management kind of logic that is prioritized, which is what AI is really good at.
But applied to a kill chain in a military situation.
That's exactly right. And so really my sense is that this logic then seeps into how the practice of warfare changes. And that changes towards a less restraint to use violence and greater application of force in trying to solve the problem of warfare in a technological way. But that is, of course, ill-advised because war is a human affairs problem, not an engineering problem. Not for everybody, of course, but for most people, killing other humans is not a natural activity. And nor should it be ever. There's something about these kinds of systems that facilitate an erosion of moral restraint through providing a technological authority, through providing a routine kind of workflow management process, and through providing a dehumanization of the targets, which become data points or which become removed as humans from that context, objectified entities, if you will.
These technologies are often sold as more humane in some ways, and that to you seems a strange word to use, I think.
Yes. I think, again, the technologies might offer on paper an idea of if we have more information, we can very precisely target one very specific person who constitutes a very specific threat. But again, warfare doesn't work that way. And what the events of Gaza have shown us is that there can be a tendency to use technologies in a rather indiscriminate fashion or imprecise fashion, regardless of how accurate they might be. These technologies might lower the threshold to resort to force for a number of reasons, rather than give us a greater sense of how to solve conflict with less violence. I simply don't have that capacity.
With all that going on and all those kind of shifts perhaps in the way people are thinking about where ethics fits, the UN Secretary General put forward this deadline of 2026 for regulation of fully autonomous weapon systems, so lethal killing machines, killer robots. How close from where you're standing, you think we are making regulation of this a reality?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I can answer how close we are, but I am a member of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control, and we are working towards making that 2026 timeline happen. I am actually optimistic. I think states are becoming more open towards making it happen.
Despite a decade of discussions at the UN Convention on Conventional Weapons about regulating lethal autonomous weapons systems, progress has stalled. Elke says this is partly because the actors developing these technologies are resistant to regulation. Still, she thinks a legally binding instrument on autonomous weapon systems is achievable.
The goal would be to have some sense of regulation. So one thing would be, okay, you cannot target humans with those kinds of technologies. The international community is concerned, and I think civil society is working really hard. The Campaign to Stop Killer Robots is doing great work in this context to find consensus in order to bring about a legally binding instrument.
Thank you so much, Elke. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much.
Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
Thank you. The conversation put the points raised in this podcast and in an accompanying print article to the tech firms Anduril, Palantir, Shield AI, Scale AI, and Andreessen Horowitz. They did not respond to our request for comment. That's it for this week's episode. Elke Schwartz has written a long-read article on her research for the Conversations Insights series, and we'll put a link to that in our episode show notes. This week's episode was written and produced by Mend Marawani, with production assistance from Katie Flood. Sound design was by Michelle Macklem. Our theme music is by Nita Saul, and Stephen Kahn is our global executive editor. I'm Gemma Ware, the executive producer. If you'd like to get in touch, please email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. We'd love to hear from you. You can also sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you like what we do, please support us at donate.theconversation.com. And please rate and review the podcast wherever you follow us. It really does help. Thanks for listening.